Next, David Horowitz contends that tax-exempt organizations of the political left, who present themselves as more aligned with the concerns of the poor and working class than conservative groups and the Republican Party, have assets over $100 billion and outspend conservatives 7-1. This is a little over an hour.
Thank you. I want to begin by thanking C-SPAN and Brian Lamb for filming this lunch and presentation. You'd have to be a conservative author to know this, but the media world is so dominated by the political left, which can't abide two sides to a conversation, that there are really only two outlets for a conservative author that would move a book significantly up the ratings lists, and one of them is a Fox News channel, and the other is C-SPAN. You also may not know this, but Brian Lamb is a Nixon Republican. In fact, he was an operative in the Nixon White House who was sent by Nixon to try to get the PBS to observe the letter of the law that created it and be fair, objective, and balanced in current affairs programming, and failed. So he formed C-SPAN, which is funded by cable companies. That's the only way you're going to get fairness in our universe here. When I look at the debates that dominate our political landscape, I'm struck by the way in which the abuse of language plays a major role in shaping the outcomes. Defenders of liberty appear on these political battlefields as conservatives, which implies that we are defenders of the social status quo. Yet, in fact, we are the party of change and reform. We are the party that wants to stop the cancer of government power, which is rapidly eroding the freedoms that were bequeathed to us. We are the party that wants to rein in the nanny state, protect the integrity of the ballot box, remove race categories and race preferences from our institutions and laws, end the march to socialized medicine, and promote educational choice for the poorest children in our schools. It is our opponents on all of these battlegrounds who have created the increasingly collectivist and oppressive status quo. It is they who have reinserted the categories of race into our lives and into our laws and institutions, who have put half the country on the government payroll and are eager to put the other half on as well. Nonetheless, in the reigning political lexicon, it is they who are called liberals, Democrats, and progressives, even though they are none of the above. Liberals are not liberal at all. They're intolerant, bigoted, and rude, and full of hate, particularly for us. If we seek race-neutral institutions and colorblind laws, they call us racist. If we point to the threat posed by Islamic fanatics, they call us Islamophobes and bigots. The only attitudes our opponents hold that could reasonably be called liberal are the sympathies they exhibit for domestic criminals and illegal aliens, for the perpetrators of voter fraud and the denigrators of religious faith, for the thuggery of government unions and the anarchist mobs that seek to reverse election results they don't like. Like the communists before them, liberals know what's good for us and are eager to control our lives to make us better. No more big gulps or incandescent light bulbs or untaxed lemonade stands. This all reflects the reality that others are too polite to mention. Inside every liberal is a totalitarian screaming to get out. And just as liberals aren't liberal, so Democrats are not Democrats. When Democrats control the White House, they make laws by edict. When they control the Congress, they rule without advice or consent. when they lose state elections, they descend on legislatures to shut down the very process of deliberation and debate. Nor are progressives progressive, unless you think that reviving the discredited ideas of Karl Marx and Jimmy Carter is the way to the happy future. The book that Jacob Laxton and I have written, and which we call The New Leviathan, begins with the observation that Democrats and progressives are not the party of the powerless and the poor, as they claim. Among the 12 richest lawmakers in Congress, Democrats outnumber Republicans 3-1. 19 of the 20 richest zip codes in America make the lion's share of their political contributions to Democrats, some as high as 86%. Wall Street raised $100 million to elect Barack Obama in 2008. But it's not just at election time that Democrats display their financial muscle, and that's the focus of the new Leviathan. It is in the space between elections, in the battles that frame the political argument, that Democrats show their real supremacy in spending their political dollars. The new Leviathan is a name we have given to a left-wing network of billion-dollar foundations and advocacy think tanks that work in concert with government unions and grassroots radical groups and constitute the largest, most powerful political machine ever assembled. The agendas of this new Leviathan are the promotion of an ever-expanding state, an ever more intrusive state, collectivist rights over individual rights, the erosion of American sovereignty, and the undermining of our national defenses. The funding core of the left-wing Leviathan is made up of 115 tax-exempt foundations with more than $100 billion in assets. How does this compare with conservative resources? The left's foundations collectively are 10 times as large as the conservative ones. The left is all frantic about the Koch brothers and their pile of money that affects everything. The Koch brothers do have a tax-exempt foundation. Its assets are $239 million. That may sound like a lot of money, but the Ford Foundation is worth $10 billion, or 30 times as much as the Koch brothers. And of course, the Gates Foundation is 3 times as large as the Ford Foundation. How did the new Leviathan get so large? And of course, what's significant about it is not only that these are big banks and permanent banks, but they fund networks of activist organizations. So if we're talking about 115 banks, we're talking about literally thousands of left-wing organizations that they fund. The answer to the question of how they got so large is in part that they took over, that the left took over existing American foundations. The Ford Foundation is a good example. Henry Ford was not what you would call a liberal or a leftist, quite the contrary. When Henry Ford II resigned, as he did, from the board of the Ford Foundation, he wrote a letter saying, complaining that the Ford Foundation had devoted its money to attacking the very system, the free enterprise, private property, capitalist system that had created the wealth in the first place. And that's only one. That's the big one, but that's only one. The MacArthur Foundation was formed from the wealth of Charles MacArthur, who is a right-wing Republican, but his children were neo-communists, and they changed the whole direction of the MacArthur Foundation, despite a fight by the board members that was lost. The Pew Trusts were created by a Philadelphia family, the Pew family, which made its wealth in oil and was extremely right-wing. But they made the mistake of appointing a surgeon whom they knew to be president, and before they knew it, the staff of the foundation, he was succeeded by Rebecca Rimmel, who is a nurse, and who announced when she took it over that it was going to support the values of the 60s, and turned it into a left-wing foundation. When Jacob and I published this book, it came out a couple of weeks ago, Senator Ron Johnson, the Tea Party senator from Wisconsin, reviewed the book for the Washington Times, and Rebecca Rimmel wrote a letter complaining and saying that in her letter, well, first of all, we had accused or pointed out that the Pew Trust, this once conservative foundation, was the largest funder of the Tides Foundation. The Tides Foundation is a $179 million foundation, was formed by two leftists, one of them the creator of Acorn. And it's basically a pass-through. You give money without giving your name, or they hide your name, to the Tides Foundation so they can give it to really radical causes. And if you look at the list of foundations that fund Tides, you will find all the venerable foundations, or what were once venerable foundations in American public life. It's not only Ford, but it's also Rockefeller, Carnegie, Kellogg, Hewlett, Packard, Casey, Joyce. These are all at the level of $1 billion. And I haven't even mentioned the Soros Foundation, which is twice as big as the biggest conservative foundation. It's a $1 billion foundation. I forgot where I was going right here. Oh, Rebecca Rimmel, yes. So she complained because we said they were the largest funder of Tides. She said, well, we haven't funded Tides in 10 years, not since 2002, except for a $400,000 grant for a dental, charity. And she said, we haven't deviated from the views of the founders. And when I read this, I said, think of the arrogance of lying so brazenly when you could just go up on the web and find out that she's a liar. The Pew family complained. And where I learned about this was a series of articles in the Philadelphia Inquirer about 15 years ago, which was a series of how the Pew Trusts were taken over. They didn't use my language and describe these people as who they actually are, which is progressives, neo-communists, people whose goal is to dismantle the free enterprise capitalist system and the system of individual rights. But they did quote the Pew family mightily complaining. Then I sent my researcher up to the web, and immediately he found out, of course, that Pew had given millions of dollars to Tides in the last couple of years. But they're so confident in their ability to get away with lying that they feel free to lie. And let me mention at this point that the research for this book, almost, I don't know if it's half the book, but an awful lot of the book are charts. Mike Bauer did these charts, which have all the foundations and all what I will call the C3 battalions, the secondary organizations that carry on the political work. And Mike Bauer went through 10,000 foundation records to isolate these radical foundations and their donees. This is just the tip of the iceberg, however, because, as I said, these foundations then fund 501c3s. like the Horowitz Freedom Center as a 501c3. Now, I've been aware ever since I got into this field that the 501c3s, when you think of, whether it's the NAACP, the ACLU, the Environmental Defense Council, all of them are really a shadow political universe. Because whenever there's a debate, I realized this when I was joined with my Senator's attorney, Manny Klausner, on panels debating Prop 209 in this state back in 2000. It was an initiative, and it was to end race preferences. Now that's your basic political debate, and it affects the actual election. There was a big battle. For example, Republicans didn't want Ward Connolly's initiative on the ballot because that would bring out the left to attack it, and so forth. So it is politics. And on the other side, were representatives of the ACLU, a 501c3, and the NAACP, a 501c3. And it was then that I realized that this whole shadow political universe carries on the political debate between elections. Conservatives hate politics. I mean, that's your basic. If you're a conservative, this is a very ugly, sleazy interference with, creativity, actually creating jobs, as opposed to leeching off the job creators and lining the pockets of your favorite causes. This is where politics takes place. There are 553, I have to remember all these figures, 553 anti-free market environmental organizations. These are organizations that blame corporations and capitalism. They cause global warming. I mean, forget whether global warming is something that we need to be concerned about at the moment. There is also a huger controversy as to whether it's man-made. But no, these organizations, it's man-made, and corporations did it, and the solution is massive government control of your life. These are the people who sponsor cap and trade, or who thought it up in the first place, these 501c3s. Thought up cap and trade. Now, what is cap and trade? Well, it means what these people want to do is they want the government to tell you how often you can turn on your light switch in your home. They're going to regulate and tax absolutely everything that has to do with energy, which is absolutely everything. How far you can travel in your car. It's the greatest threat to individual freedom that we're facing. Leading these charges are organizations like the Environmental Defense Council. And a creature of the Ford Foundation. It's now worth $139 million itself, but it's Ford that launched it and created it. There are 553 anti-free market left-wing environmental organizations, all tax exempt. They have $9.5 billion in assets. How big is that? Well, the Environmental Protection Agency of the federal government, its annual budget is less than that. On the other side of this debate, as opposed to the 553, are 32 free market environmental organizations, and their assets are 38 million. You got that? 9.5 billion versus 38 million. Mike Bauer did the arithmetic for me. That's 249 times. Are you wondering why we're losing this argument? Why? And just think of the environmental argument. Now, Obama has said, we told the New Yorker, that the centerpiece of his second administration is going to be climate change. Now, wasn't it just, 2-3 years ago, that the leading climate scientists in the world were exposed for cooking the books and deliberately falsifying the evidence on climate change because it was going against them. We have been in a cooling for 10 years. So you might think this is a little problematic to assume it as fact and make it the centerpiece of your administration. But that's what he's doing, and that's the power. Not only do they have the $9.5 billion in assets, these left-wing foundations, but of course, when Democratic legislators put through legislation, and many Republicans are snookered to going along with it, who do you think they fund? They provide money for, quote, environmental organizations, which turns out to be anti-free market, anti-capitalist, control your life, left-wing environmental organizations. How much? It's $570 million annually. It's a $570 million annual budget for these left-wing organizations. And how much do they give to the conservative ones? $700,000. I'll leave you to do that arithmetic. It's the same thing with immigration organizations. How have we gotten to a point? I was just watching Gonzalez and Marco Rubio, who I think is, would be a great vice presidential candidate. He is a spectacular figure in the conservative firmament. But both of them referred, of course, they were upset by Obama's unilateral amnesty, but they refer to undocumented immigrants. What the heck is that? Did these people lose their documents? No, they never applied for them. These are illegal aliens. But it's politically a third rail, at least that's the way they feel, to use illegal alien, the only accurate description of people who have come across the border and stayed here without going through the process of citizenship. That's how powerful this new Leviathan, this left-wing juggernaut, funded by the 115 foundations with $100 billion behind them, and 553, well, that's on the environment, there's 117 open borders, anti-citizenship, left-wing immigration foundations. Now, I would give you just a little story so you see how this happened. The Mexican-American Legal Defense Fund is the leading so-called Mexican organization, as though it's a grassroots organization, which it is not, which represents the radical fringe, or what used to be a radical fringe, on the immigration, the borders. There's really no few more important issues than borders. That's how you define a country. That's how, we have a civilization and a culture which is unique to our shores and was evolved over 250 years and more. That's why we're free people. That's why we're a creative people. Mexico has tremendous natural resources, which they've controlled, for almost a century. Yet it's a basket case, and that's because of its culture. Its political culture is so corrupt that you can't develop a wealth-producing engine there. And that's why so many Mexicans want to come here. So the definition of citizenship is really what this country is about. And if you obliterate the distinction between citizens and non-citizens, and you have no assimilation process, and in fact, you regard assimilation as a racist idea, that's the end. That's the end of this country in the long run. Well, what happened? MOLDEF in 1970 was a little civil rights organization in El Paso, Texas. And its mandate, it said in its documents to its constituencies, which were legal immigrants, You need to assimilate. You need to become Americans now. Their political mission was to secure, or legal mission, to secure equal treatment and equal rights for legal immigrants, for Mexicans who had come here, gone through the process, and become citizens. The Ford Foundation took MALDEF, poured over the next 10, 20 years, $25 million into this little organization, moved it to San Francisco and Washington, and now it's in other states, other cities, and changed its entire agenda so that now it's for voting rights for illegals. It's not only for welfare for illegals, free education for illegals, don't deport illegal criminals. It's for the obliteration of the very idea of American citizenship. And it's moved the entire national debate in the process. And I'm simplifying because there's also La Raza. This organization calls itself The Race, which will tell you that it was started by flaming radicals who hated the basic American idea. They hate the American idea. They want to portray America as an oppressive, racist, conquering country. La Raza was another little organization that Ford just poured all this money into. And of course, once the venerable name of Ford is on, it's on your docket, other foundations came in and there's a lot of corporations that are funding these racist organizations, MALDEF, La Raza. I mean, I could go down a whole list of them. Of course, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund is another one, completely created by Ford, from which we now have a Supreme Court justice who thinks that judges think according to their ethnicity. And of course, Ford is behind the whole multicultural movement in our universities. Now, the curriculum in our universities, as Jacob Laxon and I have also written a book called One Party Classroom, but I've written 5 books on this. The curriculum in our classrooms across the country is that America is a racist, sexist, imperialist, classist. It's classical Marxism with race and gender and ethnicity thrown in. And it's basically an attack on the very idea of an American civilization, an American culture, an American identity. You don't have to take my word for it. Arthur Schlesinger, a very famous liberal, but of an older generation, wrote a book called Disuniting America. Said this movement, this multiculturalism, is a threat to the very fabric of our society. There would be no multicultural curriculum in the universities if not for the Ford Foundation. And Barack Obama would not be president of the United States without the new Leviathan behind him. Barack Obama came out of Columbia, and the first job he had, his first community organizing job, which is just another name for being a radical, was with the Gamaliel Foundation. Sounds religious, actually. Gamaliel, it's religious in the way that Jim Wallace is religious, or Jesse Jackson, or Jeremiah Wright. It's a radical organization whose goal was to get lots of government money into poverty areas. I'm going to come back to getting money into poverty areas if I remember in a bit. But that's where he started. And he was picked up, well, because he already, in college, already in high school, he was a radical. So he was also picked up by the Midwest Academy. And these are funded by MacArthur and Ford and Rockefeller and Joyce and so forth. The Midwest Academy is run by 2 60s radicals, or by Heather Booth in particular. Her husband, Paul Booth, is an executive with the municipal employees unions. So this is where the alliance between the government unions and government union thugs, and they're very radical. The AFL-CIO was taken over by socialists in 1999. John Sweeney, when I say socialists, I mean that's what they call themselves. So actually they're well to the left even of socialists, of European-style socialists. Anyway, the Midwest Academy, she put him on the Voter Project, which is an arm of ACORN, and ACORN is totally integrated here with the Midwest Academy. Then he was put on the Woods Fund, which was a traditional conservative foundation, which was taken over by a leftist staffer and split in two. And who did he serve on the Woods Fund with but the Billy Ayers, a lifelong America hater, a terrorist, unrepentant. But basic to Billy Ayers is his absolute hatred for America. And he, of course, and Obama were that close for 20 years. Obama, of course, the most unvetted figure in American public life. But they were sat on the Woods board together. Obama was then put on the Joyce Foundation, which is $1 billion. This is how his credibility was built. He was trained. The Ayers-Obama partnership went into the Annenberg Fund, the Annenberg Challenge, which was something devised by Bill Ayers, in which they got $50 million from the Annenberg Foundation. This is how out to lunch conservatives are, because Walter Annenberg was a conservative who gave $900 million to the left. That's basically what Walter Annenberg did through his foundation giving. Anyway, the Annenberg Challenge was a challenge from the Annenberg Foundation to do a reform in inner city schools. The reform that the Ayers did was to bring in radicals to indoctrinate K-12 students. But he never would have got the challenge money if he hadn't been supported by MacArthur and these other foundations. So his whole career, right up to running for president, because where did the ground force for Obama's candidacies come from in those primaries to beat Hillary Clinton? It came from ACORN and the SEIU, which is a far-left government union run by Andy Stern. They gave $60 million to the Obama campaign. The unions, generally, those unions gave $400 million. Not to mention 100,000 campaign workers. So this is basically what we're facing. Now, what's wrong with these foundations? I mean, you know, first of all, of course, since the Horowitz Freedom Center is also part of this universe, although greatly outnumbered and greatly outspent, like all conservative foundations, there's something a little different in, like, the Horowitz Freedom Center has 100,000 individual donors and supporters. So we have a constituency, and we represent, in a way, that constituency. The Ford Foundation has no constituency, has no shareholders. It's just a board that was created one way or another to have a particular political profile, which doesn't at all reflect the views of its founders or the money that made it. And it exists in perpetuity, and it's answerable to no one, absolutely no one. Corporations have customers. They have shareholders. They also have customers. They've got a lot of people that they have to please. Ford Foundation doesn't have to please anybody. And the one limit to this is if you do something as stupid as they did, which was to fund a terrorist organization in the Middle East and you know, get the Jews upset, because Jews are a powerful constituency. That's too big an embarrassment, particularly when you're located in New York. So the Ford Foundation just cleaned up that little mess. But that's it. I'm sure if they offended, blacks, they'd have a similar problem that way. But when they're operating as they do below the radar, I mean, people in this audience are well informed. I think I probably told you some things you didn't know. If you read this book, you'll find out a lot more things that you didn't know. I myself was horrified when we put up, and actually the origins of the new Leviathan, our website we've created called discoverthenetworks.org, which is an encyclopedia of the left. And when my researcher, Mike Bauer, did the funders section of our website, I looked and I said, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, I mean, these are government institutions. They're funding the left. And then you look and see what they're funding, and they're funding radicals, radical antagonists to our system. This is not democracy anymore. This is a huge threat to democracy. And I'm hoping, and there is a solution, or there are many solutions, obviously, but all these foundations exist under the tax code. The tax code says, why are they all getting tax exemption? Because they're promoting the general welfare. Well, look, that's the definition. I mean, it's in so many words. You promote the tax code says you can't do this if you're supporting a political candidate. That's how they define politics. Support of a candidate, support of a political party. That's partisan. That's not the general welfare. Well, come on. You're supporting cap and trade. You're supporting open borders. You're supporting socialized medicine. That's political. That's what our politics is about. So the IRS could just redefine what's political and what's charitable. We know what's charitable. A hospital is charitable because it serves everybody. Education is going to be tricky because, as I say, I mean, the Ford Foundation's education dollars went into creating an ideology, multiculturalism, and institutionalizing it. But, you know, they put up money, I mean, for programs that propagandized, or the programs that implemented a specific curriculum, which is, I'll do it crassly, a hate America curriculum, a curriculum that says America is a sexist, racist, imperialist, classist country. So education is a tricky one. Another way, and I think this is advisable, is to sunset these foundations within, say, 10 years of their retirement of their founders. If the founder leaves the board, or if when Henry Ford leaves the board, it shouldn't exist after that. And of course, conservatives are always trying to do the right thing. I call them gold star conservatives. They get a gold star. So there used to be 3 big conservative foundations that were boogeymen for the leftists, and one of them was the Olin Foundation, and Olin sunsetted itself. It did the right thing. I don't know of any left-wing foundation that's done the right thing. I want to finish this by, I've given it out, everybody, there's this government versus the people. Where does this money go that's supposed to go for the poor? What do these government programs do, actually? When Republicans are put against the wall by leftists, people on the left, they say, you're selfish. Republicans will say, or this government program is wasteful, we're wasting a lot of money in the public schools, we're wasting, Obamacare is incredibly wasteful. All this money that's spent on these green industries is down the sewer, just gone, which is all true. But we're always subject to the attack that we're selfish. Leftists always have a victims. You don't care about poor people. You don't care about black people. Well, Republicans care. There's one constituency Republicans have, which is taxpayers. But the argument against that is, look, okay, this was a wasteful program. But look, it was for such a good cause. Shouldn't we take the risk of spending a little extra money, even if it's wasted on such a good cause? Well, what conservatives need to do is to point out how government destroys poor people, how it destroys black people, how it destroys minorities generally when it gets into action. I will give you just one example, which is very current, which is the subprime mortgage crisis. For 10 years, the Democrats, led by Bill Clinton, but especially by Acorn and Obama, said everybody should own a house, even if you can't afford it. I mean, they didn't put in that last thing, but everybody needs to own a house. That's the American dream. And so they pressured, this is such an old term, mau-mau'd. They actually got on buses and hounded bank presidents in Chicago. That's what Obama's organization did. Until they agreed, and it came under enormous pressure from the Clinton administration, to remove all the rules for lending, all that had been built up, all the lending procedures had been built up over generations as what's prudent, who do you lend to? And that created this massive housing crisis, which is at the bottom of, was a step in creating the financial crisis. The financial crisis came about for other reasons as well, but one of them was that these banks bundled mortgages which people held, mortgages which people were paying into who couldn't afford it. Okay, who are the victims here? It's not just the taxpayers. This is not just about government waste. The first line of victims are all the poor people, black and Hispanic, and also white, who were snookered by progressives into buying homes they couldn't afford and lost them. How traumatic is that? To be told you're going to have your dream and then have it taken away within a couple of years, actually. That is an atrocity that progressives committed through government programs against poor people, against black people. An even bigger hit that the black community and also the Hispanic community took, but the black community in particular, was what's happened to house values. One of the great stories of the last 50 years is the rise of the black middle class. Of course, untold in our culture. Untold in our culture. In 1939, 4% of the black, of African Americans were professionals in the middle class. 4%. Now it's over 50%. What a story. However, if you are on the rise, if you are just climbing out of poverty, or even out of the middle class, what's your main investment? It's your house. The Clinton-Obama-inspired housing crisis took 54% of the net worth of black middle-class Americans away from them, destroyed it. Destroyed it. $100 billion that black Americans had, that African Americans had, was destroyed by Clinton and Obama and Acorn and these progressives. That's why this new Leviathan, this massive, and of course they were 100% behind this idea that everybody should own a home, even if you can't afford it, are responsible for. That's why it's such a threat. It's a permanent juggernaut. It exists within and between elections, and it shapes the entire national debate and, of course, the media environment. Because one thing you learn about journalists is that they're lazy. And this will get me a lot of good press, but well, you know, you could look at it and say they're just pressed for time. So they get fed. They get fed by this secondary universe of the 501c3 battalions. And of course, and there are just sleaze operations and smear operations like Media Matters, which has an $8.5 million budget they got from Soros and the Clintons to smear people, but also to feed NBC, particularly NBC, and the other networks with their news, which certainly isn't going to have the fact that progressives are responsible for wiping out $100 billion in wealth that African Americans had until they got into the act. So, thank you.
Because we're being taped, we're going to ask everyone to line up and ask questions from the microphone. Carl, you'll be first, so please make a line if you want to ask a question. Thank you.
David, that's positively the most depressing talk I've ever heard. Surely there must be some bright line, but the IRS, your proposed remedy, the IRS, I understand, has just cracked down on conservative organizations to try to compel them to divulge their donor lists.
Of course, because, look, as I've said this before, the left, which includes liberals, progressives, communists, radicals, anarchists, they're on a mission to change the world. And it's not small changes we're talking about. They're on a mission to create the kingdom of heaven on earth, to create a classless, raceless society where there's no war and no poverty and so forth. So for them, everything is political, and they don't respect anything. When Democrats are in the White House, conservative foundations have to worry. My little 501c3 was audited. When Hillary was in the White House, she went after all the people who concocted the story that her husband was cheating on her. That's where the vast right-wing conspiracy comes from. The people forget. That's their mentality, and that's a real problem. But in November, we're going to take back all three branches of government, and I'm hoping that Republicans will have the attention span and the cojones to actually do something about this. We had for 12 years, we could have done this, and nothing was done. Nothing. These foundations weren't looked at. It's a disenfranchisement of the American people. There are plenty of Mexican Americans who don't want open borders, who don't want illegals coming here and competing with them for jobs. But they don't have a vote like the Ford Foundation does.
Just one aspect. Do you think the Citizens United decision has any tie-in with this, and it may be one of the bright lights on the horizon?
Well, this is a basic battle between individual rights, the rights of individuals to assemble, to organize, to have a voice, and the collectivist idea that we're going to control you. And yes, I think that the Citizens United decision was a great decision, and that it has obviously it's freed up a lot of funds, but they're going into elections, and it's the trench warfare between elections that it determines the framework. It would have been unthinkable 30 years ago to be talking about undocumented immigrants when you're talking about illegals. Nobody in his right mind would have talked about that. I'll give you another example, which is Obamacare. It failed in the Clinton administration. When Gore ran, he was against it because it was so unpopular. When Kerry ran, he was against it because it was obviously unpopular. When Obama ran, if you'll remember, he said government control is wrong and private is wrong, right? Yet it became the centerpiece, right in the middle of an economic crisis. Instead of jobs, it was Obamacare. Because for the left, that is the door to the socialist future. And it was totally ideological. It was not political in the normal sense of politics. It didn't make any kind of sense in terms of what the country was facing, but it was pushed through, and it was pushed through by these foundations. We describe this in the book, by these foundations.
David, with the possible exception of the Bill Gates Foundation, most of the foundations, the humongous ones, were founded by people who obviously believed in free enterprise. How did the left take over those organizations?
I give you an example of one which was, I think, kind of stalled. There's a foundation, a $2 billion foundation, the Daniels Fund in Colorado, which we mentioned in our book. And it was formed by a very conservative gentleman. And the people who, the board of the foundation wanted to run a professional foundation. So where do they turn? The Ford Foundation, because the Ford Foundation has, school, and before they knew it, they had a whole staff of leftists. I happen to know people on the board. We applied. Conservative applicants were, dismissed, and so forth. And this happened in part just because of that, because there hasn't been enough publicity about what the Ford Foundation actually does and what these other foundations do. Information is a huge problem. And the second thing is there are always going to be family members who have, strayed from the founder. They didn't make the money. They probably feel guilty for being rich. There's not, it's not just white guilt. There's just guilt. It's class guilt. Plays a big role in this. The Rockefellers, were a pretty conservative American family. Peter Collier and I did a book on the Rockefellers. So 30 years ago, I interviewed Stephen Rockefeller, who was then a philosophy professor at the University of Vermont. He told me, he said, I'm a socialist. Now he's the head of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which is a huge foundation, hundreds of millions of dollars, and they fund radicals.
How would one safeguard against such usurpation?
I don't think you really can. If you're leaving money, it's a huge problem unless you provide for sunsetting the foundation. You can't foresee what's going to go on through three generations. I think that's why I like the idea of redefining what's political, and just saying if it's political dollars, you're not going to get the tax exemption. You've got to just give to charity, and which would be hospitals. I don't want to devise a reform while I'm standing here. I'm sure that some wise heads can figure out the problematic areas like education, but I think that's the basic solution. The other is you got to sunset it. You can't have wealth existing in perpetuity. And what's the problem with giving it away while you're alive?
Hello, David. You touched on La Raza, MALDEF, and all these open borders groups and their might. Recently, we have this declaration by Mr. Obama. There's two parts to this. Can you reflect on why the media seems to be unable to handle any aspect of illegal immigration other than to talk about some woolly-eyed view of someone who was brought here when they were 8? And wouldn't it be nice to be nice to them? There's no talk about emergency rooms filled with illegals, no talk about public schools filled with illegals. Chain migration and things of this nature never gets discussed.
Because it's racist. That's the left. Look at if I may just scroll back, since I was a kid when this was happening and my parents were communists, but the McCarthy era. There was a Washington Post article by Nicholas von Hoffman which told the simple truth, which is that 99% of the people who McCarthy interrogated were communists. That means they were part of an international conspiracy. They wanted America to lose the Cold War. They wanted one of the most monstrous regimes in history to triumph over America. So whatever else you can say about McCarthy, he was onto something. You know, I've written, you know, critical stuff about his methods and this, and he discredited the cause. But the fact is, there was a huge internal communist threat. But the left has made McCarthy is the devil, not the communists. I just watched a 2-hour, oh, I didn't watch it, but I came across a 2-hour celebration of a communist hack named Pete Seeger, whom Bill Clinton gave a Medal of Freedom Award to. And, you know, the Communist Party, it's just part of Americana, which is what you will learn in any liberal arts college practically in the country today. That's the problem. So people in the media are scared. I mean, anybody, even the ones who know what's going on, are scared too. Well, there's two things that go on. One is they're scared. They don't want to be tarred and feathered, which happens to anybody. Yeah. I mean, the good news is that our kids in college, the ones that speak out, have been tarred and feathered as youngsters, so they're going to be pretty bold when they get into, you know, politics, the Congress, and into media. That's happened already. There's a whole generation of young conservatives who aren't intimidated. But much more intimidated than conservatives are so-called liberals. They're scared because they will be cast into the nether regions. And I can tell you, when I left the left, the most difficult part of it was losing every friend I ever had in midlife. And that's what keeps them there. That's why all the name calling, all these things, you say, how can people, you know, be so rude and so uncivilized as the MSNBC people are? That's why, because it keeps people in line. Oh. The other thing is that they won't tell you the truth because it will hurt the cause. Now, I had been in a green room with Bob Beckel, who has told me that he watched a very significant conservative figure, Coors, write $1 million check to Jesse Jackson because Jackson was threatening to extort him in the beer business. And as you probably know, Jesse Jackson got, by threatening a boycott, that means threatening to call the beer industry racist, got two $30 million distributorships for his sons. So it's extortion, it's intimidation. But why hasn't Beckel told this story? Because he's still partisan of the cause, and he doesn't want to hurt the cause.
Okay, and then on a follow-up to that, which is that I wonder if Mitt Romney would understand that most of America, I'm a worker, most American workers, most American people who pay the taxes, who work, they want to hear about chain migration, they want to hear about what it costs to schools, and they want to know about every single aspect of illegal immigration. They get no information about it, and I wonder if you think that Romney, or someone could tell Romney to actually get involved in articulating this and to touch all those third rails.
There's two questions there. I think Romney knows full well what's going on. The other is, Americans will never hear that. If Romney were to talk, of course he wouldn't talk like David Horowitz, but even approach, the reason they call it the third rail is there would be just such a storm of attacks of its bigotry and his this and his that, they would never hear the facts. You never hear the facts. You can just look at what's happened to all of us who have just tried to point out that there's a serious problem with organizations in America like CARE and the Muslim American Society and the Islamic Society of North America. They're all Muslim, and the Muslim Students Association are all Muslim Brotherhood fronts. So we're Islamophobes, bigots. You can see us all over the web. If I were running for office, I mean, that would be a death sentence right there. So it's a very big problem. And that's why I'm thrilled about the emergence of the Tea Party. We need a grassroots movement. That's what the left has done. They have the grassroots movement. It's made the Democratic Party a left-wing party from top to bottom. And we need the Tea Party to And there's another dimension to this, which everybody's aware of, which are these kind of social issues that run this way, and that's a big problem. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to be a politician. It's tough. So I don't expect Romney to come out swinging on that. And Marco Rubio knows all this, but they understand the political issue. Right now, the universe, our schools are controlled by leftists, our media is dominated by leftists. While that persists, there's a problem. I think we've made progress on that front, but we're not there.
David, cutting to the chase, who would you suggest should be Romney's advisors so we can win in November?
His political advisors. I think he's doing very well. I like what's going on.
Who are his advisors? Do you know who is
I can't name them. I mean, I know some of them. Jim Talent, Debbie Troy, but they're I don't know who his political handlers are inside. I promised I wouldn't mumble here. As somebody who came out of the left, when I grew up, the communist left, and I use that with a small c. I mean, my parents were actual members of the Communist Party, but anybody who called themselves a progressive was basically a communist, was a pro-Soviet. When I grew up, we were ghettoized. We couldn't say what we believed, and we were targets, and we were quarantined. That was a good thing for the country. It was a very good thing for the country. I watched the left. The new left was formed by children of communists and fellow travelers like Tom Hayden, but most of the people who formed the new left were communists. And I watched us break out into the mainstream. And then when I was leaving the boat, Hayden and the other communists went right into the Democratic Party and in the McGovern campaign, and McGovern was a supporter of Henry Wallace, the Communist Party progressive candidate in '48 himself, and I watched him take over the Democratic Party. And that's taught me how important it is to have that grassroots, year in and year out movement. And there's never been one since I became a conservative until the Tea Party. And I am hoping that this holds. The problem conservatives have is they have real lives, unlike leftists. They have real lives. They're creative. They're going into the private sector. When you're doing a business, you don't want to alienate anybody. I mean, you want every customer that you can get. So you don't want to get involved in messy things like politics. So I didn't think for a while that it would ever happen, but it's happened. And Wisconsin is a watershed. I mean, the left declared a war on Scott Walker because their, incipient fascist arrangement with the state was being threatened. That's what these unions, they got a stranglehold on the state. They got to have their hands on the public purse. They fund their political machines out of taxpayer dollars. They raise the salaries of their members. It's totally corrupt. They have absolute contempt for the democratic process. They picked the fight, and they lost. And they lost on the ground where conservatives have never really been strong. And that tells me, and that's the bright spot I see for the future. I think that Obama has put fear into ordinary Americans who understand, who are beneficiaries of the free enterprise system and the system of individual rights, and who will hold on to those American values against the left. So I'm expecting big things to happen in November. Anyway, that's my optimism. Thank you. Thank you.
For more information about the author, visit horowitzfreedomcenter.org.